As our nation heads into its semi-quincentennial or 250th anniversary, we look at a man who many American colonists felt had become a tyrant because they believed he had violated their traditional rights as Englishmen. King George III, the King of Great Britain from 1760 to 1820, was the longest reigning British monarch up to that time. Now, King George II died suddenly in a famously unglamorous way from a heart attack on the toilet in 1760. George III, at age 22, automatically succeeded him as king. George III was determined to strengthen British control over the empire after the costly French and Indian War, and with his royal proclamation of 1763, forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists believed Britain was denying them land they had fought to win. Now, with the British Parliament working in tandem, George also increased enforcement of taxes on colonists on imported sugar and other goods to raise revenue from the colonies, and he became more infamous with his 1765 Stamp Act, which required tax stamps on newspapers, legal papers, licenses, and other printed materials. The protests in the colonies picked up, and George III became viewed more and more as a tyrant as the Parliament put forth acts requiring colonies to provide housing and supplies for British soldiers or for putting new taxes on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. By 1770, when British soldiers killed 5 civilians in Boston after tensions rose from the military occupation of that city, George III's image in the colonies had become very negative. The 1773 Tea Act gave the British East India Company special advantages in selling tea. Colonists saw it as another attempt to force them to accept taxation, and George III was the figure they were increasingly rebelling against. By December of that year, they famously dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor in a protest that has been known ever since as the Boston Tea Party. In 1774, when the Colonist Continental Congress met, delegates united to protest British actions and petition the king for relief. King George III decided not to provide relief or compromise. Instead, he declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion. He prepared to suppress it by force. The Continental Congress asked the king to restore peace. King George III refused even to receive a petition. Reconciliation was not going to happen, and a war began. Still, the hope for peace existed. Some colonists tried to get George III to agree and put an end to the war. The Continental Congress asked the king to accept the Olive Branch Petition. Once again, George III refused to even receive the petition. War continued, and on July 4th, 1776, colonial leaders listed 27 grievances against King George III and explained why they believed he had become destructive to their rights. They declared independence. There's a legendary story that George III's diary entry for July 4th, 1776 read, "Nothing of importance happened today." However, King George III did not actually write those words, and there is no authentic diary entry from him on July 4th, 1776 saying that. It's a myth, but a powerful one. News of the declaration did not reach London that day. Crossing the Atlantic by ship took several weeks. King George III did not learn of the declaration until later in July or early August. Now, we should note that in 1781, King George III was not present at Yorktown to surrender and wanted to continue the war. But Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States by signing the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783, though George sent British representatives to act on his behalf. George III's perceived tyranny brought a feeling that America needed elected officials. Colonists could not vote for King George III or remove him from office. They argued that he exercised authority over them without their consent. The United States Declaration of Independence states governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Between 1765 and 1775, colonial assemblies, merchants, and the Continental Congress repeatedly petitioned the king to protect their rights. The founders did not simply reject George III, they rejected the idea that the chief executive should inherit power for life. Instead, they designed governments in which legislators would be chosen by voters, though voting was initially limited. State governors would generally be elected or selected through representative institutions, and the president would serve a limited term and could be replaced through elections. In short, our founding fathers would develop the greatest nation ever with the idea in mind that they did not want another King George III.